Right. Good morning, Nick. How you doing?
Good morning, Record. Great. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm okay. We've been doing this for almost half a year already. Time flies,
Have we
they say.
really? Well, wait. Why do you mean you're okay?
I'm always okay. I'm not worse than okay, but I'm also not great.
You're bummed out, aren't you? You're stuck in that house.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're
I
not
don't want
leaving.
to, absolutely. I'm feeling the strain of the pandemic and the home office, etc. I don't want to whinge. I still feel like academics are very privileged in how they had to deal with this pandemic here in Europe and maybe even in the
Yeah.
US. But I'm not great. No, absolutely not. I haven't been for some time now. But I'm okay. And I gotta say this. I mean, this podcast thing that we've been doing for the last 5 months, that has been clearly the one of the, if not the highlight of 2021. So
Oh,
I wanted to say thank you, Nick. That
my
was
brother. No, thank you. This has been your idea. You do
yep,
everything. I
yep,
show up and run my mouth.
absolutely. You should.
So no, by all means, thank you. It should be the other direction. I think we've gotten a lot of good. I just got an email this morning from someone saying that they've been passing this along to uh, especially grad students, and he wishes he had this when he was a grad student and when a PhD student. And so I think some people are finding what we're doing pretty
Yeah,
intelligent.
you know what? Like I was talking to my a new doctoral student of mine, a girl, and she wants to do qualitative process theory stuff. And I recommended a different podcast to her, which I listened to yesterday, the Ethnography Atelier, and they featured an episode with Steve Barlett, which I listened to, and it was great. And I was thinking, man, it's so cool that we have these podcasts and we can listen to one of the greats. And he goes on for an hour or so about his work over the last 30, 40 years. And, it reminded me of what Youngjin said last time, how good it is that we have more such material available so the next generation can simply consume it and be better than us.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was a very nice way to look at the work, and it's not one that I was accustomed to, but he's right. He's right. You said create better conditions or create conditions for great research to come out, and anything we can do there to help that is a good idea. And you guys were right.
Yeah. So now we've done this. We're very happy we did this. It was all you, but now you are going on a vacation or something, aren't you? It's because Germans take the entire summer off.
Well, actually, here we think that Americans take the entire summer off. Don't you have this weird thing where you get 9 months of salary and you get summer, you don't get paid, so you don't work or something?
Well, yeah, so you don't work. Well, first of all, not every school does it that way, right? Different
Okay.
schools have their different ways of paying. But yeah, the traditional way you do it in the US is you get a 9 month salary if you're a
Okay.
researcher. And then the 3 months in the summer, you're supposed to get summer support. And you can do that with external funding. If you're a good researcher, sometimes your university will do that for you and that sort of thing. And then that makes up the other three. So if you get let's say someone hires you for whatever, $150,000 as your base salary. That's really a 9 month salary typically. And then the idea would be that if you're a good researcher, they, 3/9 of that would be added to the top of it. And that would be your actual salary per year. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not going on vacation because technically speaking, as a professor in Germany, I don't have vacation. The way that this system is set up, that I'm constantly working and I'm constantly being paid, and it doesn't matter how much or how little. So I'm supposed to look after myself, which includes taking a break, but I don't have any number of days of leave or anything like this. It's just for some time I am allowed to say, look, I will be hard to reach for a while, but it's technically not a vacation as what normal people would have.
But wait, I thought Germans had like 6 weeks of vacation or something, all of
Yeah,
them.
but not professors, because professors are servants of the states, right? I don't get a salary either. I get some sort of, well, it's a salary, but it's something else. We're all state-based universities, so we're all employees of the state. So I have to swear by the constitution and do all that sort of stuff. But I'm a servant of the state, which is also why I get a particular pension at the end, not a superannuation. And
Mhm.
so the idea is that your worldly matters are being taken care of.
Yeah.
And therefore, all these sorts of rules don't really apply.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the
Huh.
idea back in the day, this is Alexander and Wilhelm from Humboldt days, so 200 years ago. So the idea would be that you free the great scientist, the great mind of all worldly matters and concerns about income and safety and job security and all that. So he can go and do and think about stuff that he or she deems important. So that's where all that is coming from. The reality, of
we
course,
benefit from this. Us non-brilliant people get to benefit from.
Well, the idea is honorable. The reality is obviously much more mundane very often. But yeah, like in this case, in July, our idea is to go offline. Go to some place in the wilderness where there's no internet and very rare cell phone reception. We often do that as a family. Yeah.
So our podcast is going to take a break too, right? That's the plan.
That is the plan. So this is actually the last episode. And we're going to start again in fall. We haven't decided on a date, but around September, I suppose, we're going to kick back into gear. And we have a few highlights planned as well. Some new formats. We'll do some conference stuff. We'll have some special episodes about the managing AI special issue that we talked about a few times. And then, of course, we'll come back with other topics and discussions and people we get on the show and so forth.
So today we should close up with a couple of, close the loop on some things that we brought up in this season. And then, maybe we'll open it up for people to let us know what they want us to address or maybe who they want us to bring on for next season, which is starting in the fall.
Yeah, all right. So, I have a loose end I wanted to tie up real quick. So in the last episode with Yang Jin, actually not the last episode, but the episode with Yang Jin about theorizing, where we drifted up into imposter syndrome, I just quickly wanted to mention, we still want to do a full episode on this, but it reminded me of a brilliant thread I once read by a good friend of mine, Hayo Ryers. He's a computer scientist professor, and once tweeted.
I see him on Twitter all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's active on Twitter. He does BPM stuff, but he also once did a very long thread on imposter syndrome in academia. And I'm going to put the link in the show notes, but it's a very good thread and he calls it out openly. He offers the definition. He also links to certain studies on imposter syndrome in academia, which basically show that it's a mixture of some systemic conditions, public or peer pressure and so forth, and also based in the types of personalities that academics tend to be, a little bit introvert, a bit shy and so forth. And both of them, sort of contribute to imposter syndrome being a problem for many academics. And he also gives a few tips on how to deal with this. So number one, speak up about it openly. Number two, discuss with a mentor. Number three, an interesting recommendation is to actually engage in mentoring others, because that so you learn for yourself how valuable your insights and your experience already is to others that haven't been around as long, and so that sort of helps overcoming it. So it's a very good thread. And I remember that when I read it first, I felt that was very helpful as well. So, so it is a thing, and there's some guidance and help out there. I just wanted to point that out.
So imposter syndrome, I know nothing about it. I believe you that it's a thing, but I don't think it's a thing for everybody, right?
No, of course not. But it's a thing for many people.
And the reason, so let's talk about what imposter syndrome is. Imposter syndrome is that you think that other people around you are brilliant, successful, high achieving, all these things. And then you think you don't belong here. You're somehow maybe inferior, internally you're inferior, you put on an exterior, but really everyone around you has outclassed you, right? And you don't belong. That's what.
Yeah, and absolutely. And two more aspects to it. Number one is this sort of constant self-doubt. That whatever you're coming up with, your analysis, your idea, your theories are just not good or not good enough or not good compared to others. And the second aspect to it is this a constant fear of being exposed as a fraud, as an inferior, as an imposter. So that goes with it as well. Yeah.
You know what I think comes where and this is without any understanding of the research, I'm just going to run my mouth about this because I have a theory on why, and whatever, a folk theory, a common sense theory on why this happens. And I think it's because these are A students. So usually professors and PhD students are the very best students. Okay. Usually if you're a mediocre student like I was, you don't go into your PhD. I, through some circumstances of life, ended up getting my PhD as I was a little bit older. But I think most people go when they're fairly young, around age 30 or a little before, a little after, to get their PhD. So they're still quite young and they're phenomenal students. If they weren't phenomenal students, they wouldn't be getting their PhD. And in order to be a phenomenal student, you're constantly getting feedback from your professors from a young age. They set expectations, you deliver on those expectations, and you get a nice A. So there's this constant feedback. There's this constant, and then the other thing is they tend to be career academics. So they're a little bit insulated from the indeterminacy of the world. So they're used to excelling in a place where expectations are set and it's determinate. Then you put them in a situation where now it's indeterminate. All of a sudden, there is no right answer. There is no test. There's no person telling you did well and didn't do well. Now it's internal, and they haven't had a lot of experience outside of the academy where indeterminacy is where you got to deal, right? And then they get in the situation, and maybe there's a third where they put those professors on a pedestal. They think that those who have arrived and achieved are phenomenal, and they've always respected them very highly. So I think the key to not having imposter syndrome is to realize that those people you respect very highly are flawed humans muddling their way through like everybody else. It's to be comfortable with indeterminacy, to realize that, hey, there's no right answer, actually. It's all judgment calls, right? And then the A student one is another thing. Whatever you do doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be good enough, and then you iterate to make it better and better, right? So
I think there's something to it. So when we talked about it, and you constantly refer to your beliefs in American pragmatism, right? Yeah. And one of the implications of that worldview is that you don't think that academics are a very highly eclectic, esteemed elite, right? Huh. Which is, horses in the water doing the same thing as everybody else. Yeah. And if that is true, then I think some of these fears about putting people on a pedestal, obviously not the case, because if the super professor is just the next guy from the street, then you wouldn't put him so high on the pedestal. So I give you that. The other 2 points about what you just mentioned, I think another issue might also be that number one, what you have to do to get to the PhD entry is very different from what you have to do then in. You called it about determinate and indeterminate questions and answers. That's something. I think it also implies that whatever strategies got you there are not going to work anymore. So I've seen this quite a lot, that the people that came in with the best grades, straight A's, GPA, coming into the PhD, anecdotally, I would say, like, very often they don't do very well. They're very good at memorizing and using all these learning strategies that give you straight A's, but that's not necessarily the skill set you need from there on in.
So back in my undergraduate, people got C's, right? Which may not happen anymore. And we even had some professors force a C-based curve, where a C was average, a B was above average, and an A was excellent, right?
Yeah, so I've done that too, actually. You're not anymore, but
Yeah, so keep in mind, this statement comes from that background. And this professor came to me because I was complaining about getting a C in his class. And he said, well, don't worry about it. They tell you to be good to your A students because they'll come back and be the professors of the future. And he said, be good to your B students because they're going to be the shakers and movers. They'll be out there in the world. They'll be in your corporations. And he said, but be particularly good to your C students because they're the ones who are going to come back and donate you a chair. And his logic was that they learned how to do good enough, right? The A students are perfectionists. The C students kind of figure it out, that what do I need to do to get by in this domain and that domain? And then they're hustlers, a little bit more. And I think that the publishing game, to an extent, accommodates those hustlers sometimes better than the perfectionists.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. Perfectionism is, I think, a tendency that a lot of us have, and it's not helpful at all. Absolutely not. And in no sense of the word. The other thing I wanted to say is maybe another reason might be that as you finish your PhD and you become a professor of sort, maybe a young, freshly minted assistant professor, but professor nonetheless. Well, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter how good you are. All of a sudden, you're exposed to a group of pretty smart people. That's how I look at it, right? So of course that's intimidating, because to that point you were always the superstar in your class, in community college, and probably also in your PhD program.
Yeah.
So in a PhD program, there's more or less well-accomplished students. So there's a little bit of a hierarchy there. And then you get dunked into this entire world, the community of professors, and there's more people that are, at least as good as you are.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, I always find amazing that as soon as you have your PhD, no one gives a crap about it anymore, because it's just the entry ticket. No one cares because everyone's got one. So, it takes all the fun out of it, so to speak. So maybe that also contributes to it. But, I like, you didn't believe me, but so you would have realized by now when I have doubts, about the quality of the work. You notice this in the editorial, you would also notice this about the work here. I do also have that fear of being exposed as a fraud. Oh my goodness. I think it may have gotten less over the years, but every now and then, absolutely. You've never had that feeling that
not even for a minute.
Now someone writes an email and figures out that it was all crap, bullshit, wrong, in any way fraudulent or bad?
No, never for a minute. I've always kind of considered myself a non-academic academic. So I think part of imposter syndrome is that you're representing yourself as an academic. So I just figured, hey, I came from a different background. I have a different perspective. For me, the difference between someone with a PhD and someone without a PhD is 4 years, right? I don't actually think that professors are necessarily smarter than the regular, they just chose a different route.
I believe the same thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't hold this career. I love this career, and I think it's wonderful. And I think we need people in our society to do it and do it well. But with that said, I don't hold it in any place higher than any other career. So for me, it's very much, hey, this is what we chose. Let's do the best we can. And let's not, there are brilliant people. So the nice thing about our careers, we'll run across the brilliant people. And I don't think I'm one. I don't pretend I'm one. I would love to be one. And I'm trying to be a scholar to catch up to some idealization of what I imagine one would be. But I've never claimed to be one. And frankly, most of the people I know are not one.
Yeah.
So I don't really, my expectations aren't that high. So because of that, I don't really worry about, I'm not a fraud. I am what I am. I am what I present to be, there's no.
So, this is a bit of a dampener, right? But I think it's good that we touched upon this. Here on my notes, I had a different question I wanted to ask you here, which probably helps us to switch topics and enlighten the mood a little bit. Nick, what's your funniest experience being an IS academic? Can you remember an incident that was just the funniest thing that happened?
I mean, there's so many. I guess, I could remember, there's so many. Did I ever tell you the story about, I did tell you, I told you the Dick Boland story, what he told me about reading books. Did I do that on the podcast?
No, absolutely not. I'm not even sure I know the story.
Oh, all right. This was me. Dick Boland, as you know, is a brilliant scholar, right? And he's the one who taught me the difference between what is a scholar and what is a researcher. And he said, a researcher reads all the current and knows in, say, the last 5 years in their domain, what the current state of understanding is in their domain, and they extend that in their niche. He said a scholar is someone who maybe doesn't know current research at all, but understands the timeless issues. And we'll go back and read, philosophy and the greats and all of that. So of course, this was his distinction between a researcher and a scholar, but I think he was talking about himself, right? He didn't like reading research papers, but he liked reading the books. But he was a beautiful writer, and he was, of course, one of my mentors at Case Western, and still is, right? Although we don't collaborate or work together on anything anymore. But anyway, when I was a PhD student, I went up to him, and after he said that, I'm like, I want to be a scholar. He's like, well, what you should probably do is read like a book a day. And I'm like, a day? He's like, yeah. I'm like, okay. So I went to the library, I got books, and I can name some of them. People like Weick and Churchman, these are hard.
Churchman in a day.
Yeah, these are hard to read. So I was doing that, and I'm skimming through them, and then plus I had all my other PhD. I did this for like 2 weeks, where I was attempting to read a book a day, and it was hard because I didn't understand about 90% of what I read, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I go to him like 2 weeks later, and I'm like, Dick, I'm trying to read a book a day. I can't, and none of it's getting into my brain. I don't know what I'm reading. He goes, oh, I told you that. That's bad advice. Don't read a book a day. And I'm like, oh, gee.
Okay, that's very good. I like that very much.
What about you? What's a funny story?
I was trying to think of one. I mean, a lot of them involve whatever happens at the conference dinner parties. So I don't think we want to go into there. So I don't want to, fuel my reputation of being a drunkaholic even more.
I'll tell you what happened to me that I noticed at ISIS receptions a few years ago when I was a PhD student and very early in the program. I would get the name tag look, and then when you were talking to people, they would look around while talking to you, and then you could tell that they didn't want to be talking to you anymore. What's funny is I noticed at a certain point that didn't happen anymore. So that's when I realized I must have arrived, because now I can be at conferences and people actually want to talk to me and not just like stand by me and look around for who they really want to talk to. So I became a destination, I guess.
That is the thing that happens at conferences. Absolutely. So, what I like is every now and then when people put little Easter eggs into papers. You know what an Easter egg is?
Oh yeah.
Like a software programming term where people programmers put little funny thingies into games and proper software. But sometimes academics put that into paper as well. And I always like it when I find one. And every now and then we do that as well. So for example, with my good friend Jan Mentling and I, when we did the European Journal special issue on project management and digital innovation,
put an Easter egg in there.
We put a little Easter egg in there. So, it's an editorial and we had 3 authors and it was like, well, someone has to go first and it's alphabetical. It's Mentling, Pentland, Drecker, I think, right? And then there's a footnote on the title and everyone expected to say, well, author order looks alphabetical. But what the footnote actually reads is the author order, I can't remember the correct text, but it kind of goes like, author order may seem alphabetical, but it's actually a complex algorithm comparing hair length and thickness or something like to that matter, right? So, and very, very few people spotted it. And those who did usually write an email. So, things like that.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't spot that. We should
What I also did in my PhD thesis, I think, is I had a lot of references, like hundreds and hundreds of references, some of which were web pages. And around that time, we all said, like, no one's going to read your thesis. No one's going to check the references anyway. So I said, okay, I'm going to put in a reference to some web page, and the web page is a fake web page. When you actually click on that link, it takes you to a web page that reads like, hey, congratulations, you actually found the Easter egg, go and pick your prize. No one ever did. I'm not sure that web page still exists, but I did put that into my thesis.
So we could tell funny stories all day. I could tell you. So Sean Hansen is my good friend, and he's at Rochester Institute of Technology. Mm-hmm. We got our PhDs together. And when I gave one of my first presentations ever at a conference, I did it on some of my NASA data. And the very first question to one of my very first presentations, and he was there, was someone raised their hand and said, and it's an institutional argument, it's social theory, right, about implementation of an ERP system. And someone raised their hand and looked at me and said, have you considered the technology acceptance model? So he said that it was really funny because I just stood there looking at him, and actually Young Jin was my co-author on the paper, had to chime in and answer the question, because for me it was such a, I don't know, like you're bringing a different paradigm, of course I know TAM, it's like, so I was actually frozen there for a second because I'm like, how do you respond to a question like this? And well, what's the funny part of this is then after that, whenever Sean and I are presenting, like I know I did it to him at least once, and I'm pretty sure he did it to me multiple times.
Oh my God,
when you're presenting, the other guy would raise their hand first and say, have you considered the technology acceptance model? And then you're in a room full of people. You have to take it a little bit seriously.
So we have an audience. We've never asked them to do anything, but here it goes. So people, the next time you are at an IS conference and you meet Sean Hansen, and you will remember seeing Sean Hansen. So he's the biggest, tallest.
He's enormous.
He's enormous. He's the biggest quarterback type of IS scholar, the only one in the field, literally. Anyway, so when you see him present, I want all of you to raise your hand. And when it's your turn to speak, ask the question, have you considered the technology acceptance?
Exactly.
Get serious about it. So yeah, let's get that.
As a matter of fact, they should do that to you too. If you ever see Wrecker or any of us, that should be a thing we do in our field from now on. Whenever anybody presents,
even at panel, like very important panels, diversity and inclusion panels. Sorry, I've just been working on that topic, so it just pops into my head. So diversity and inclusion panels. First question: have you considered a technology acceptance?
Oh, that would be bad. Maybe when we do our live session in ISIS, we'll see if anybody's listening to this podcast. See if someone will come up and ask us the question: have you considered?
Oh, very nice. So actually, that brings me to another topic, because you and I, we sort of half completed our PhD at the same time. When was it for you? I did my PhD in 07 or 08, I think.
Yeah, I finished in 09 is when I actually got my diploma defended in 08.
So at that time, then, that was the sort of post-TAM area, right? So we grew up in that area where it was like, oh my God, don't do TAM. TAM is dead and not more TAM research. I wager that the current generation of people that are listening to us, they have no idea. It's like, what are these guys going on about TAM? Because this is a thing of the past. It really is. There's no TAM research anymore, not to the extent in the early 2000s, where literally every second paper was some modification, application, replication of technology acceptance, wasn't it?
Yeah, people outside of our field thought we were the TAM field and dismissed us because of it, right? They said all they do is cross-sectional research on technology acceptance. It's the most boring field in the world, right? I heard people. So when I got my PhD, that was the idea: just do anything other than TAM, right? That was kind of
it featured in my PhD.
Did you use TAM?
Yeah, to some extent, because I was. We talked about this last time. I worked on that process modeling standard that just came out, BPMN 1.0, and it was a new standard, and it got widely adopted very quickly. So adoption was a thing. So how the hell was I going to study adoption without using TAM? And I did cross-sectional survey, etc. I did all of that because that was sort of just the standard procedure at the time. I haven't really done anything like that since, but at that time, that was the go-to method. Absolutely.
Well, BPMN started in 2005, right? Is that
4? Yeah.
4?
Yeah, 4. And I started on 5. And I don't know how it was for you, but it wasn't my idea. But the idea for my PhD was Michael's. He said, why don't you go, there's this new standard out, why don't you go and study that? And he didn't necessarily say study adoption, but I was like, okay, that's good. I wanted to do empirical stuff. I'll go and study what people do with it in practice, which included adoption and use and quality and blah, blah, blah.
No, my dissertation, I was going to study Ford Motor Company's drive-by-wire program. They were working with TRW. They were creating new steering, right? It was like predecessor to, a drive-by-wire, electric navigation of the car. But so I started interviewing people at TRW and at Ford. And then they canceled the program and told me I can't do anything with my data. So I'm like, really? Great. I just spent 3 months of my life. I proposed it. I did, and I can't do anything with the data. And it's like, holy cow. But I was already working with NASA with Youngjin, and then I just pivoted and collected more data and went that direction.
So one of the questions we got very early on in the podcast by, I can't remember who it was. It was a lady, and she said, "Can you do an episode on the most popular, the most common dependent variables in IS research?" And I thought it was such a great question, sort of, just to tackle a little bit. So, we talked about TAM. So obviously a typical historical dependent variable is intention to use. We don't have to talk about it because it's a bullshit variable, honestly.
Well, it's one of those where there was intentions to use, and then they found that the intention to use isn't actually that correlated with use.
No, of course it's not. It's sort of like, what my intention is, if a fire breaks out where you are, my intention is to come over there and pull you out of the fire and, and save you. Whether I'm going to do that is a very different question. Yeah, because I'm a good man. But, if I ask you about your
I study implementation, which the next thing you do is appropriation. So there's use as if it's binary, and then there's appropriation, which is how you use it. And that's one thing we found, is that your initial use is not always like your your subsequent use, right? You'll do workarounds, you'll do all sorts of things. People very enthusiastic early may choose later to not be so enthusiastic, right? So yeah, use appropriation. The other thing is fit, one of the classic dependent variables, different sorts of fit.
Can I come out and say I expected all these answers, but if you listen to them now, 2021, you know, intention, use, appropriation, and fit, aren't they boring? You know, all of them speak to here's IT, please use it. All of them to some level. Let's hope it fits. Let's hope you appropriate it in the right way. Let's just plain hope that you use it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's sort of, all of them are sort of driven by the idea like, oh my God, technology is such a wonderful thing. Let's get everyone to do more of it.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where there's the real organization, and we're going to make sure technology fits the real organization. There's your real work. We're going to make sure you appropriate technology into your real work. There's like something that was technology, something that wasn't. And I think now the reason these seem so quaint and not, and at the time it was the case. I mean, when I started in the world, there were still paper-based processes in the world.
Absolutely, yeah. And there were people not using email. So the original TAM paper was a valid question to ask.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you get people to take word processing and email system in the 80s, which is when they came up? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But now it's like asking what your business and your technology fit is kind of weird, because there's no business without technology, right? So it's less about fit. It's less about, so now we're in a tough spot. So I'll give you two domains, and I'm going to ask you what are good dependent variables. One is innovativeness. What's a good, because the fact is innovation, as we know, doesn't have, we can't measure innovation in the same, especially if it's like a project. How do I know an innovative project from a non-innovative project, right? So how do you measure innovativeness? And then another one is change, which I guess is similar, but I was thinking more like routine dynamics and such.
Yeah, right? on that second one, I have some ideas because I've been working on this as well. But the first one, innovativeness, I would say a lot of people traditionally have tried to measure innovativeness through creativity. It's more creative, it's more different, it's more unusual in that sense. And I always think that they've overlooked a second part of that definition of innovation, which is value. You know, it's not just a new idea, it's just an out of the box that it's a new idea that yields value. So I think a good measure would be the delta in value, you know, some sort of before and after comparison of whatever value might mean. And value might mean a whole lot of different things, but it could be, you know, sort of net profit, of course, could be satisfaction, could be efficiency, could be
so actually if you look at
comfort or whatever. Yeah,
the work in creativity has two dimensions. It's novelty and utility.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a bit of value in the utility, right? Where the creative outcome is not just something new, but it's new and useful. But I think what you're talking about too is innovation generally has to do with generating business value. So you can't take it away from there, but then you could have the most, so this is the tough part, right? You can't just look at its consequences. If you want to know if your process is innovative, for example, you can't look at a discrete consequence. You have to look at other indicators of innovativeness, right?
Well, I mean, at the moment, there is a lot of people that work in innovation. I think they go by this idea of innovation as recombination of sorts, right? And then if you go by this, then I think you could measure form and extent of recombination. How much is recombined? How is it recombined? You know, what's the structure of the recombination? So in a way, it could be a very nice formative variable if you think in quantitative terms. So you can, if you take three things, then you could combine it in many, many different ways, and all sorts of permutations. For example, you can, of course, combine 2 things, 3, 4 things, many, many things. So that could be another measure of recombination. There could be a different quality of recombination, you know, and just because I combine 2 things doesn't necessarily mean it's good, you know. So I think that notion lends itself to being quite measurable.
Right, you want to know what my favorite measurement is of kind of innovation type? I don't know if you remember the Harris Kyriakou and Jeff Nickerson's paper from a few years back on 3D printing, where they
I like nice paper
recombination. They had like distance scores of geometry in the like 3D printing models, right? And they and I think at the time that was the dependent. I don't remember. It was a really cool variable. I'm assuming, I can't remember the paper entirely, but I think it might have been the dependent variable.
Well, I'll give you a shout out now, because they just had another paper accepted. It's sort of follow up on that, also from the Thingiverse setting. Just got accepted in MISQ. It's listed on the forthcoming page, where they go with this, and they go with a distance metric. They search on a landscape, which is really cool. They say like, well, if you measure the innovativeness of one design, and the design could be, and I think in the original paper they had designs similar, for example, whistles, little whistle 3D printing schemas of whistles, and they had a look at how innovative these are, how different they are, and that's where these distance metrics came in. And now they followed up on this, and it's a very nice paper. I think it looks at the same idea, so distance, how different, how innovative are different designs. But they say it's not just a function of the design, it's also of the design landscape. How many different type of objects are already floating around in the Thingiverse? So it's a really cool, nifty idea following up on that. So you asked about change, right?
Yeah, change.
So change, especially in dynamic and processes and so forth, I think there's a number of really cool variables to measure change. One of them is distance. Yeah, so in the same sort of network-centric terms. So there's great ways of measuring the distance between networks that quantifies how different they are. Right. So if you think about social network, your social network of people from my social network, they're obviously different, and we could quantify that. And we could quantify over time, maybe you and I share more and more friends together. So the difference between our two networks, social networks, might become smaller, right? And there's a couple of network distance matrices that would allow us to quantify that. So, and if you think that processes are also sort of graphs, network graphs, then you can apply the same ideas, and you can say that process is so and so similar and so distant from another one, and that would allow you, for example, to measure before and after a redesign initiative. How different is your new design anyway? How different is the Uber process from the taxi process?
And that's the idea of drift that they came out in that recent paper, right, with Brian Pentland and those.
Right? Exactly, and they actually use network distance metrics, Euclidean distance, I think, right? Another one that goes in the same direction is that you don't look at the distance between two forms, but you look at the inner organization of the form, the structure. And in network terms, that would be for example, the extent of clustering. How clustered is a network graph? Is it densely clustered? Is it very dispersed? And again, that you can measure that before and after at 2 points in time. And again, you would have a measure of change. Measure of change are always before and after, so to speak. I mean, how else would you measure change if you don't have a measurement at some point and at some other point? Otherwise, you wouldn't never be able to estimate the delta, right?
Yeah. And we do it with our sequence analysis stuff, again, all inspired by Brian Pentland. He had his sequential variety. With Aaron Lindbergh, we wrote a paper where we look at order variation and activity variation in processes, right? So there are a whole bunch of different sequential measures for, and the reason, to me, the reason we get at these, right? You're looking at network dynamics, you're looking at sequence dynamics, is because the dependent variable is hard. In the sense of if it's an innovative process, if it's, how do you know if you're delivering on an accounts receivable if all of your accounts receivable processes actually do take care of accounts receivable? Well, then there's no concluding output. Maybe there's time, but is shorter delivery on an accounts receivable always better? Well, no, not if there are a lot of exceptions. Then if you're handling the exceptions well and not handling them short, then maybe you want them to go a little longer, right? So these simplistic measures of, say, processes where it's like how fast, percentage completion. Well, if my percentage completion accurately is really high, like approaching 100%, then that becomes less interesting, right? Now it's more about things like variation, things like the dynamics within the practice or process.
I think that's a good reason why we focus on these so much. The other reason, I think, plain and simple, is that we now have more data available to us that has timestamps on it. And that's what you need to be able to measure change, right? So, all the digital traces, they all basically automatically have timestamps on it. And because you have that now, it becomes possible to measure change and variation and innovativeness and everything else you want to measure before and after. And that wasn't very hard to do. It wasn't impossible, but it was a lot harder to do before digital traces. So now I think we have more attention to these sorts of phenomena, these sorts of measures and variables, simply because we have data that speaks to them. So very pragmatically, I think we do a lot of things because we can, or because it's easy to do, simple, right? Which is also why we have so much research on, online reviewing. And there's still papers on online reviews coming out left, right, and center. Sure. And why? Because it's very easy to write a crawler that gets you all the Amazon reviews and the Yelp reviews and all that sort of stuff.
Yep. Or open source software, which I write a number of papers on open source stuff, but open source development. But that's just, our argument is open source development. The reason we're writing it is it's kind of a harbinger of future organizing form, right? Where you organize on a platform and do creative work. And it's probably partially true. But the other,
I think it's because it's easy access.
You can get it.
Yeah, exactly. You can get it. In fact, GitHub, for example, they build APIs for researchers to make it even easier.
But it is a cool domain. Come on, you can't pretend like, oh, you can get it therefore. But I would say recommendation systems too. That's kind of a cool domain, and it's important.
I'll give you a different example. Digital entrepreneurship, so tech startups. Most of the research for many, many years was basically done on the basis of TechCrunch data. Now, TechCrunch is a database that collects data about entrepreneurial ventures, the startup teams, where they come from, who the angel investor was, if they have publicly available data on income rounds, that would be in that. And a lot of the research is entirely sourced from that database. Why? Because TechCrunch is a database that collects all that information for researchers. So in other words, a lot of people studied startups without having to talk to a single one of them, for a while. This is why we have a lot of crowdfunding type of studies, I think, because that's data that is more readily accessible than other data. It's certainly easier than talking to 20, 30, 40, 50 startups over a period of 5 years as they build their ventures. It takes too long. We don't have a lot of longitudinal research because you would have to do it for a long time. Yeah, absolutely.
I actually give, when I'm as an editor, I give the benefit of the doubt to people who got real intra-organizational data as opposed to the easy stuff, meaning my own stuff. That doesn't mean that I'll somehow penalize someone who comes with an open source paper or something like that. I love that stuff. But if they have, hard won in an organization, interviews or surveys, again, if it's a survey, it can't just be cross-sectional. It has to be something, either matched pair or some sort of time series, right? Something. But yeah, I like intro because I think that's harder to get, and I kind of want to give them the benefit of the doubt even more so than others.
I know what you mean. Like, I give benefit to really true longitudinal studies. And I don't mean longitudinal studies where someone said, we did a bunch of interviews in 2018, but we speak about things that go back to 1990 or whatever. Okay. But we never talked to someone that was actually there in the 90s, right? So, but I mean, if there is a paper that is truly longitudinal about, I don't know, big merger that took place over 7, 8, 9, 10 years, a big transformation initiative that took, a decade, and there's data on this, I think then these authors have a lot of leeway, because obviously you're going to have holes in the data and it won't be perfect. And of course there is, the longer that you go back in history, the less data you have and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's people give them leeway because, very frankly, we don't have many of them. So any one of them will be good to publish. Really.
You can usually publish a few papers from those. Like my dissertation, right? We had Youngjin's first interview at NASA was like 2003, before I started my PhD program. My last interview was 2008, right? So we had a lot of data, and I had 3 really good publications come out of it, right? So yeah, if you have that, you can, and I could probably publish more if I actually wanted to look at it, but at one point you don't want to look at your data anymore. So.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, the other thing too is it's an unusual choice for a PhD, because you often talk about what you advise young researchers not to do, right? You say stick to a method, do some empirical work, don't get into the big theory stuff. I don't necessarily agree with this, but I will say, like, most PhDs should rightfully don't do longitudinal studies. It's a type of study that doesn't gel very well with the format of a PhD program, with the limited time exposure.
Unless it's a 2-year ethnography.
Yeah. But I mean, like real, absolutely, real longitudinal stuff, right? So I hold in high esteem all these educational researchers, for example, that study whatever happens we do to little kids and then study whatever becomes of them 20 years later. I've never done that, but you need some stamina for that. Absolutely.
We should do that sort of thing. Those of us with tenure and comfortable, we should start those projects, right?
We should indeed.
We should have more in our field. All right. Are we done, or are we going to have more topics? Because I was going to bring up the thing we both talked about before we started our podcast today.
Let's do that.
Alexei.
Let's do that and wrap it up. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Alexei Altonen wrote this little LinkedIn article about academia as a competition. And, I walked away from it. Yeah, a lot of it resonates. But the thing I walked away from it is now I've been in these academic circles for 15 years. And yes, academics think a lot about our work. Those of us who do research think a lot about our research, and we spend a lot of time working hard. And then sometimes even those of us who work hard just never get the breaks, and we don't get the top tier publications that some other folks do. And, maybe we don't have the resource endowments that others do. Others come in with networks. Like I was very fortunate to have wonderful advisors, wonderful network all the way through. And that helps, right? So some don't have that. So it's this situation where they're the haves, the have-nots to some extent. And there's this competition to be a have, and you have to work your ass off, and you have to, and the thing I took away from that is, yes, his article was pretty accurate, but isn't this true about virtually any field in the world, that to be super successful, you have to be super lucky, number one. Number two, you have to work your tail off, and it requires trade-offs. You can't have it all. You can't have like the best work-life balance. You can't have the just fit it into 40 hours a day and not work hard, yet still claim to be the top of your career. I mean, there's no career where you can get away with that. Be at the top of your field and have just perfect, comfortable work-life balance and bracket your work away from your life. I mean,
yeah, I think there's something to it. I mean, there is, as in sports, right? I mean, you can play sports at a lot of levels, but if you want to play at the top level, you want to compete at the top level, you gotta be a little bit competitive. So I have I guess a complicated relationship with competitiveness. When I was in Australia still, they did a lot of performance coaching, things like this, and that usually included self and peer evaluation across one of these personality schemes. There's a variety of these, but I scored very high in percentile always on competitiveness. So in my late 20s. Yeah, absolutely. And it makes a lot of sense. It was very big.
Even though you're very bad at basketball, because I beat when we played.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's where it came from. So I remember scoring the 98th percentile on competitiveness. And and then some people said, "Oh, you got to work on that. It's an issue." And I said, "No, that's me. That's sort of makes me." So one thing, I think that's 15 years ago. I think so you mellow out as you become old and have a bunch of kids and settle down and all that stuff. So I don't think I'm as competitive anymore. I do think there's some value to it because it inspires you to be better and become better and learn and progress. And I see many people around us that are getting a little bit too comfortable with their status, their reputation, or their achievements, maybe. And I just couldn't picture myself doing that. I do want to push myself still, right? So that within limits.
So you pivoted though. It sounds to me like, and I almost think, if I could say this, that the young men are competitive, the old men aren't as competitive anymore, especially if they've been somewhat successful. And I think it becomes, certainly in my life, it's less about competition. Like, I'm not looking at other people. I can honestly say this and say, I want to be them. For me, it's about goals. So it's goal oriented. I have certain things I want to do and I want to accomplish, and I try to do that. Right. I'm not putting up a benchmark of other people. So I think some people are competitive, where they look at, that's the type of person I want to be, or that's someone who I graduated with, or and I want to make sure I'm better than them. And,
are you sure? I've never actually seen that.
You've never seen people be competitive?
Well, I have, but not in the sense of, well, my graduation class, in my eyes is to see where these and these people, and I want to be better than them.
Oh, no, I'm not going to name names, but not in my PhD program, but in others, people have told me this, that I came out in that, in this particular, and I'm just going to be very vague because I could give this away very quickly. But I had a conversation with someone that said that superstar came out of my cohort. We were the same time. So I always just check myself with that person, and, and I don't measure too badly. And, now I don't know if that's that person's only motivation, because I don't think competitiveness by itself is going to get you very far. It's competitiveness plus a whole lot of other things like luck, brains, grit, all the things it takes to get published, writing ability,
Well, the other thing about academia, it might be, there's elements of competitiveness too, as Alexei pointed out, but it's not a zero-sum game. If you're successful with your research, it doesn't diminish my likelihood, ability, or probability to be successful too. So
Right.
that means it can be very friendly competitiveness. So, maybe there are friends that you, compare yourself with in terms of how many papers have you published, etc. But if one of them, if you publish a nice paper in some nice, whatever, I'm happy for you. Right. And the competitiveness in me is maybe in the sense of, I want to be able to do that too. But, not in the sense of you have achieved this and therefore I can't, and therefore I'm jealous, or, in that sort of sense. It's not a zero-sum game.
Do you know my competition with Stefan Zeidel? Did we ever tell you what it is?
What, the citation competition?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is your opportunity to boost it. You can get ahead now.
I should give you, so our goal is 8,000 citations. I think last time I checked, he was ahead of me in citations, but we're close enough, right, for it to be a competition. You have already beaten our goal, right? I think you're over the 8,000 already, and you've been for some time. You're a superstar. But we were thinking, all right, once you get to 8,000 citations, then you've arrived.
Oh, that's it. Wow, that's completely arbitrary, by the way.
Yeah, it's totally arbitrary. But we decided, for whatever reason, that we were having a drink, and we decided 8,000. First guy to 8,000. The other one has to buy him a nice bottle of scotch.
Okay, do you want me to take a bet here? Because I think you're both about three and something, but you're both on positive trajectories. Yeah. It's complete coincidence.
And we write together, so it sucks.
You write together. So here's where I sit on this, right? So there's a little funny one to end this episode. So number one, I said to Stefan once, he told me about this once, and I said to him, my bet is on you, on Stefan, because I think he does a few quirky, interesting things. He really does. And I think all of them carry a lot of potential for being highly cited. You have more papers and more papers in top journals and all that sort of stuff, but I think he does quirky stuff. So I always thought that he's going to win the race. Now with his, far-reaching podcast, of course, the wheels have turned. I mean, you got to race by him. Absolutely. And I'll come out and say, like, by the end of this year, you've leapfrogged him.
Because of the podcast?
Because of the podcast, of course, that's my prediction here.
All right. I hope you're right. Yeah, so to those
complete utter nonsense, of course, but yeah.
I don't want to discourage you from citing Stefan Zeidel. Go ahead and read his work and cite him, even though you're friends with me. But just make sure you cite my work more, right?
Cite all of us, in fact. Yeah, look, Nick, I think it's time to wrap up, really. Been a great half year almost. We did 13 episodes. I'm not sure we had a clear goal in mind when we started. But in my book, I think we've achieved very well here with this podcast. And as these things go, it took a very different direction, and it has different value to the people that listen to it, and probably also to us. I don't think with that we started off with having an eye on emerging scholars. And I'm not even sure why we started this, to be honest. But if this is one of the things that creates better conditions for those that follows, I'm very glad that we did it. It certainly helped me in this year, which hasn't been all that easy. And it'd be good to take a break and come back with the season 2. That's usually where the plot twists come in.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we need plot twists.
We need plot twists, absolutely. New formats and maybe even a new logo. We'll see.
All right. Season 2. All right, my brother. Well, thank you. This is your creation, and you deserve all the credit. I'm glad to be along for the ride. I think it's totally fun.
It is totally fun.
And see you in the fall.
See you in the fall. Have a nice summer.